Welcome to Mystic and the Skeptic radio show and podcast. Today we have a special panel discussing race in this part of the world. The reason that we're doing the show is because we've been part of this. People say it's been the last 4 years. Actually, it's been going on for a long time, where there's all kinds of misinformation, misdirection, rewriting of history, or deconstructing history of all kinds of things related to people that live in this side of the world and the way that they're identified, the way that the race is used either against them or as a, to give you a sense of pride and to move forward. So I reached out to my artist friend, Angela Fama, to help me look into how can we discuss this in the most creative way. Originally, it was going to be an art project, but I think that this is kind of like brainstorming to get there, or a different expression of it. I feel that sometimes these big ideas take forever to come about, and I don't think there's any time to waste. I think we should like jump on it, and people come to me, and we'll talk about this throughout the series, and they say, David, why are these people acting up? Why are these people doing this? So in a previous conversation with one of our guests, he was saying that there's a thing called buffer communities, and we can go into that. But maybe I stand somewhere in there where people think that I'm like again, I have to be careful with how I describe things. So I'm like the intermediary between different groups somehow. They assume or they think or whatever. And I would love to do that. I would love to help people build bridges and connect. But now is the time to actually take a stand and to educate people and to help them realize that their ignorance or their lack of understanding can be very harmful and destructive. So we want to educate people, we want to help them grow, and also to lift up the unheard, the voices that are not being given a platform in our show, and then kind of unravel some of the misconceptions and issues that have been coming up in the last few years. So we're gonna go around, and I would like for everybody to share where they're from and maybe a little bit about their background. And again, the biggest issue that we're gonna discuss today is how do we even identify ourselves, and how do we want people to recognize us as either a part of a group or as individuals, and how that now has become politicized and muddied with all the stuff going on. So if you don't mind, Angela, we're going to start with you. And I know it could be a very complicated history of how you came about, but just tell us why was this interesting for you as well?
Okay, but hi. I am interested in this. When you put the call out to me, because when I was doing the What is Love project, which is where we met, one of the things that came up while I was having interviews with individuals across North America was race. And at that point, this was like 5 or 6 years ago, and I saw it, and I was aware that there were some boundaries that there was a trust that wasn't necessarily there between different racial groups when I would show up. And even though I wanted to include every voice I could, I recognized, okay, I need to learn more about this, how to integrate, how to soften the lines of understanding between where safety is and what that can be. So when we do speak with Jerald as well, I met him in the What is Love project, and I noticed there was much more willingness and openness to be included in my project. And it was based on color or race or communities that we were a part of. Like I needed a facilitator, I needed people to work with. And it's even to talk about it, even to say the word race, even to say that out of my mouth, I'm uncomfortable. And I've been learning so much in the last couple of years about what that is, what the dialogue is within the community I grew up within, which is the non-racist, just silencers, I guess. Like, didn't even really realize how much that's still contributing so greatly to the different layers of power within the structure that we live within in North America. So really briefly, and I'm so honored to be a part of this. So Amber, I'm so glad that you were here with us. David, Jerald, this is exciting. Really exciting. And I don't know if you wanted to know, but I think it's important if we identify sort of what our racial, I've been trying to learn how to say that.
The
Or should
question
we
is, what do you identify with? Because I met a friend that told me, I know I'm this, but I actually would like to be part of something else. And there
Yeah.
was a question about trans racial identity. So where do you feel mostly connected and what is it? And it's okay if it is white, because some people are now like, I don't know if being white is okay. It's like, well, if that's all you are and you are like the best of it, then God bless you.
Yeah, I don't know right now. I have a really intersectional understanding of identity. And even when gender comes up, like I'm just kind of like, I don't know. So with race for me, I didn't grow up within like a straight heritage. I wasn't like, oh, I grew up in a white, British home. I'm pretty much a description of a third culture kid or globalized. I didn't know my father ever, and I don't know his history. I had no father. So then my mother cut herself off from a Roman Catholic, I guess, second generation Italian on one half, and then Métis French on the other half. So but I didn't grow up with any of that heritage in me. My mom was a little black sheep, played music, welfare, punk rocker. So I grew up outside of that. And then to throw it off, I was born in the States on the farm, and then lived in Ottawa, and then spent my high school years in Zimbabwe in a rural area, and then came back. So I feel like words have been thrown at me like third culture kid. I think I identify with that the most. But then when we talk about color, I'm on like the low end of the white scale, I guess, because I used to get teased for how dark and dirty I was when I was younger, because my skin tone, like technically on paper, I'm white, and I know the more I learn about race, I'm still very white in the privilege that I've had. But I also don't really identify when I look in the mirror, I don't see that. But so it's complicated. Yeah. Yeah, I didn't get that. I don't have like that. When I think of people who grew up within a culture, like when people say second generation or third generation, I think of families that grew up with something that was taken from one place, placed in another, uprooted, but I don't even share in that. So it's kind of like I'm a bit of what happens when globalization sort of does that. And I used to call myself a mutt when I was a kid. Like I had no idea how to kind of identify my race.
You're a child of the future.
Yeah. And I in an intersectional class or a class about diaspora, once the word hybrid comes out in the more like when people are being more kind about the mixes that are happening. Yeah. And that thought of like what happens when you don't have something you're pulling from to hinder you from the future. So I'm quite open to learning anew, and I have so much respect for all of the different ways that things can be seen, all the different cultures, different heritages. So yeah, I would say I'm a bit of a melting pot. But technically white. When I'm asked on paperwork, that is what I have to write. So
we'll talk about that too, because I find that it's kind of like forcing you to identify yourself, and it can be used against you. So Amber, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm from Vancouver, British Columbia, the unceded territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish Nation, and Musqueam Nations. And I'm from the Wet'suwet'en Nation myself, which is in northern British Columbia. We made recent international news because we shut down Canada for a few months over some pipeline protests. I come from a long line of advocacy and multiple generations of First Nations lawyers, government officials, etc., that have been really working hard to advocate and push forward the First Nations equality in Canada, which is a very big struggle. I am also from 9 generations in written history of chiefs, including my grandparents were both high chiefs. So with that comes a lot of you know, what do I want to say? It comes with a lot of, I don't want to say like that we have to, but chiefs raise chiefs raise chiefs. So it's like a torch is always being passed. So I come by my advocacy very honestly, and I am recently really rising to that in my 40s, and with the guidance of my chiefs and my aunts and uncles. So that is sort of what I'm doing in the world today, advocating for First Nations in Canada. It's a very big, and especially youth, really wanting to push through growth and expansion within our youth sector so that we can like generationally push forward. And just like David, I have found myself kind of in a bridge position. I am actually half Caucasian. So with that comes a lot of privilege. I'm lighter skinned. I was raised in the city, so I don't have a reservation accent like some of my cousins do. So if I'm darker skinned like them versus who I present to the world, I definitely come to the world with a lot more privilege than some First Nations in Canada. And I'm also the child of an outed gay man in the 80s. So I grew up in Gay Village, Vancouver, with my dad and his partner. And so that brings me to a very colorful life of equality and just seeing, again, gender fluidity, race fluidity with my within my family structures. That is a whole other ball game as well. Racism within one side of the family versus another. And I think somebody touched on earlier just about trust. Like Angela, you said something about coming into the world and seeing racial mistrust. This is a big thing in our community as well, that like, you know, when you talk about a Caucasian member coming into chat with anybody from the First Nations, there's lack of trust there, and there is a response often that the trust should just automatically be given. You know, there's an entitlement to trust when you're a Caucasian person, where you want to show up, say like in a reserve or whatnot as a government official, say, and you just expect that they should trust you, and God forbid that they don't, then, you know, it's their fault, or they should just automatically trust. There's an entitlement there in white privilege. So these are the types of things that I'm hoping to educate and create some kind of a bridge on, so that we can, like, our, you know, I don't have children, but our grandchildren and grandchildren can like have a totally different existence than what we've been experiencing. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Remember, I tell people that I was raised by Mexican rednecks. And what I mean by that, well, actually, I should be more cautious with my assumptions of people. I found out that redneck is actually a good term. Is the fighting whites, like the whites who are like pro-labor, but then it got turned into hillbilly, and that's not right. So I was raised by Mexican racist or white supremacists. Have you ever heard of anybody from Latin America bring that up?
Oh.
So again, with the Spanish, you know, I got a lot of issues with the Spanish. So, you know, the Portuguese started the slave trade, and the Spanish started the enslaving of the First Nations, but they couldn't enslave the First Nations, so then they either converted them or massacred them, or both. So my family was raised under that mentality, and they would say the same stuff as people here. It's either passive racism or active racism. So it's like, you know, stay away from certain people, and all people are like that. And very few Latinos actually acknowledge that that's a thing. I think now it's cool to be down with the people in Mexico, but if you actually live in Mexico, you know how it is. So coming out of that, for me, it's been a transformation that is still a challenge, because it's kind of like taboo to not be part of that kind of mentality. And then there's class issues. So if you're rich in light skin in Mexico, you get away with it more than if you're poor. If you're poor, you're down with the people even if you don't want to. And then in the US, you're just Mexican. No matter what you pretend to be or claim you are, and that you're different or you're special or whatever, you get thrown in the mix with everybody. Um,
Great.
Jerald, it's can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience with race? You're very blurred.
Thanks for having me. I was born and raised in Anderson, Indiana, which is where I'm speaking from now. So I was born in the Midwest. Race has always been a focal point in my life, obviously. So I was really interested to just happy to be a part of the conversation. It'll be interesting to see where we go with it. But I'm down to listen and learn.
Well,
Moving on.
We appreciate everybody's openness, and this is a difficult subject, so we're working through it. So today I wanted to discuss a very controversial topic, but I think we're going to push that to the end. There was a couple of things that both Angela and Amber shared that I wanted to dig into. So the first issue was this idea of the government asking you to identify yourself for whatever purposes. I almost got fined $50 for not wanting to fill out the census. Is that a Canadian thing too, or is it just American oppression?
Oh, we definitely have the race question on our census as well. I don't know if we get fined for not filling out the census though. Angela, do you know?
I don't, if I'm honest, I don't know that I've ever filled a census out. When was the last one?
There you go with your
But I can't remember.
Well,
Yeah.
the last one was a bit controversial because they did like a short form and a long form, etc. You don't remember that?
Nope.
But yeah, it's like, it has like however 20 like different race classifications or whatnot. And of course, like you can't pick more than one. So it's like, what do you identify with the most as a mixed race kid? That's always a little confusing. For sure.
Yeah, I don't,
But
I didn't say, sorry, go for it.
no, I have no idea if we get fined or not.
Yeah, I've never been fined. But the same thing, there's the boxes on a lot of things when there isn't an option. There's often like an other and then like a
Other.
space, like, so sometimes I'll just fill that one out. But it's very this, or this, but no multiple checks. But
I
no
pick
fun.
other all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'll share my experience. So, when you come from Mexico or any country, when you first get here, everybody's like, so where are you from? Because of your accent or you're awkward or whatever. And then they try to pair you up with another person from your group. And not all Latinos like each other. So you'll be at a party and they're like, so-and-so is from over there. And I'm like, I've never been over there. I don't know what you're talking about. But they speak Spanish. And then you try to so they try to categorize you and group you. And then one time I told somebody, I'm a citizen of the world, kind of like you, Angela. And they looked at me like I was crazy. And then they demanded that I identify myself as a Mexican. Kind of like what Donald Trump did to Jon Stewart. He told him, why did you take out your Jewish last name? Aren't you not proud of being Jewish? So that's the kind of thing that they pull on me is like, so you have a problem with being Mexican? Is that why you don't want to say you're Mexican? And so now you have people imposing your own identity on you. And like we talked about people who struggle or they have issues where they now it's like no matter what you do, you can't get away from it. So in one conversation we had on the show, I was talking about how the reason that there's African American studies programs, or Mexican American studies, or Jewish studies, or for Islamic, whatever, is so we can identify ourselves, so we can celebrate ourselves, and we don't have to be depending on other people to tell us what our culture is about. And I think that that's a big, important part of this conversation, that the classification of North America is whatever they came up with and the way that they want to look at us. And there's like 5 different terms for a Latino now. And I don't know if I identify with any of them. And you have to kind of like join those groups. And some of those groups don't even want me to be part of their, because we're different generations of immigrants. That's the other challenge. Like, you might feel or not feel to be part of something, and then do they want you to be involved? So in one of our previous conversations, as we were getting ready for the show, Amber, we were talking about groups that have struggled to be identified or be acknowledged, such as the First Nations, and how now there's a structure and a system, and you have to be part of or a member. And then there's some people who would say, well, I would like to be part of that, or I have some ancestry or whatever. And then you have to go through a process. And then Angela was talking about how the people of the future, or what the French Revolution was fighting for, was that we would just all be brothers and sisters, and there would be no, other than maybe nationality or something, there wouldn't be any separation or distinctions. And sometimes in progressive movements, you run into that, where people are like, why are you making such a big deal about where you're from? Aren't we just all human? We should just, not even care about where we come from. And then in other instances, they make such a big deal about where you come from that they kind of limit you or separate you and kind of try to define you, kind of like what we're talking about. Have you guys ever experienced that, or what do you guys think about these issues that I'm bringing up?
Well, in Canada, we also have like race-based legislation called the Indian Act, which like actually defines First Nations individuals based on how much blood they have. And that was put into place like back when Canada was founded, and it was basically to keep First Nations and the Indigenous of Canada like really suppressed and segregated. That's the whole base of this legislation. And as far as I know, it's actually the only race-based legislation in the entire world. And we have it here in Canada, and it's still enacted to this day. We still are defined by that. And it's interesting because what you said is like you kind of have two sides of things, where you have First Nations that don't actually want to be defined that way. You have people, because of the way that this rolled out, and you could actually give up your status, or, it could be taken away from you at certain points in history. And that would define whether you were actually Indigenous or not. And so here's a funny story. My grandparents, who are high chiefs, 100% First Nations, were considered not First Nations of Canada because they were enfranchised by the government. But then you also have people who, don't want to be a part of it. And then you have people who say, well, I have like 1/16th First Nations and I should have a status card. So it's like a very interesting conversation. But at the end of the day, it's actually a racist part of our legal law and governance of Canada that keeps us actually suppressed. So it's an interesting conversation to have. I want to be a part of it, but I don't want to be a part of it. And in Indigenous culture, it even goes beyond that to like spirituality and stuff, where a lot of people want to be a part of that, but then they don't want to be a part of like the full culture.
You use the term enfranchised. Does that mean that you were, what does that mean?
Yeah, so that's like basically if a female First Nations person, like this is back in history, married a white person, then they would be their status would be taken away. Or in my grandparents or great grandparents, it was actually a choice that they made in order for their children to not go to the residential schools. So my great grandparents had 2 of their children go to residential school, realized that their kids weren't getting any education that way. And because our nation, the Wet'suwet'en Nation, never actually treated our land, which is why we have a Supreme Court ruling in Canada that says we have the rights to 22,000 hectares in northern British Columbia, that they couldn't really fully legislate them under the Indian Act. So my grandparents chose to, or my great grandparents, sorry, chose to enfranchise, which means leave the Indian Act and say that they're no longer Indian. Under the Indian Act, which we don't use that term anymore, but Indigenous to Canada. So they basically, Canada said, you're no longer Indigenous. You're one of us. You get to have all the rights of being Canadian, but you no longer get to be Indigenous Canadian. So my grandparents actually ended up totally thwarting the system and playing them at their own game by buying land, etc., and then doing our ceremonies and potlatches on the land that they purchased because they had the title now. So enfranchising just means basically you no longer are classified as an Indigenous Canadian, and you don't get to do anything First Nations. You have to be white now.
It's wild because a lot of people don't know about the history of Mexico, and Mexico was influenced more by the French than by the Americans. And even though they have a constitution and they kind of became a country around the same time, they took some ideas from the French of this nationhood thing. So I think that after they tried to enslave the native population and it didn't work, then they tried to convert them and it didn't work. Then they came up with these things like, okay, we're all just Mexicans. So forget about your previous associations. We're just gonna. They came up. There's a term called the race of bronze. So we're all mixed. So we're all one people. And then they try to get rid of the indigenous heritage. And I was sharing with you guys that we had the first indigenous president, I think, of the whole continent, but he dressed and acted like a Spaniard. And no one ever even talks about him being indigenous. Like he's considered like one of our first presidents. So then there's this thing of like erasing your heritage to be accepted. And I feel that as an immigrant, it's the same thing with Latinos and with other groups, that if you are too Mexican or too anything else, you're automatically singled out and dismissed. So when people now are looking at the election and why so many Latinos voted for Trump and things like that, they need to consider that a lot of people have assimilated so they can have access to resources. And then that's used against them. So they're judged because they're trying to survive and they're trying to be in with the in crowd. And then now they're the bad guys and they're just as racist as the racist. But it's like, that might be the only choice. Just like in Texas, your only choice was to stop speaking Spanish, because if you spoke Spanish, you would get beaten and mistreated. So then there were generations of people that lost their language. In your travels, Angela, are people even like willing to bring up that stuff, or is it too much to dump on white people? Like, what have you come across in these conversations?
I would find, like, I can only speak for the community that I'm across, like that, not across, but that I have access to. And I would say with gratitude, a lot of the white peers that I have in the last year specifically have started learning. And then the more I'm aware of that, the more I'm able to see the people that have been around me that have been learning for a lot longer. Because race, I'm a little more schooled in the intersectional language of gender, and race sits within that. So now I feel like this is that second part. For my own learning, I had to figure out the gender disempowerment, and it helps me to understand the race. So with the people around me, it's hard. I was in a, not hard. That's not the right way to put it. There's a lot of silencing and a lot of guilt. And if you think about like kids that have been playing in a toolbox for so long, they don't really realize they've been playing with other kids' toys, like, and you say, hey, that's like, you've got like 12 toys and your friend over there has maybe one if they're lucky. Like, it's it's still in such a new state of understanding the deep roots of how embedded the system is, that I feel like around me it's exciting because there's a lot of people starting to realize it's not up to other people to do the work for the white community to be learning what part they have within the racial dialogue. So I hear a lot of shifting happening, but not all of it is. It's like so many things need to be understood before even understanding, like what empathy is, what it is to hear a story and not try and turn it into your own because you don't have the capacity to understand what it's like to grow up in a body of a different color in our cultures that we're currently living within on a mainstream. So yeah, I can only speak from my own, like just I only know my own experience within. And I don't know if you guys have heard of this. I'll briefly say this, and then I'd love to hear from Jerald as well. There's like this thing about like a privilege game, and it was about gender as well as race, and it was just talking about who's of the, to kind of display to people with privilege the differences, and all these questions are asked, like, take 2 steps forward if you grew up in a one-parented home. Take 3 steps forward if you are of white skin color. Take 5 steps back if you are this. And whenever I've played those games, I'm in the back with usually a transgendered person or a person of color, and then there's like a whole bunch of people in the front. So for my experience, I'm on the line. I'm in this space where I can only say my own experience, and I'm embarrassed by how little I knew before I started learning. So it doesn't stop me from doing it, but it's challenging to see everywhere I turn. There's like I went to a park in the summer in the Shuswap, I'm not saying the word properly, area in BC, and it had been recently retitled to be more understanding of the true heritage of the space, indigenous culture, but the person who wrote it, I'm quite sure was white because of the way that they worded what they were saying about, like they tried to make it seem backward, and I was so infuriated, I couldn't even go on the walk. I was like, I can't even, like, fuck, pardon me, but to try and like, to just to realize how settled. So I see a lot of people around me starting to realize, oh my fucking, we're sitting in the top of the top of a structure that's so hierarchically power formed that it's taking a lot. It's so embedded. It's taking a lot to really understand clearly what race is and how white is such a huge part. White is a race. White is a part of that, and it needs to acknowledge its performativity in it, its creation of it. It's crazy. So I see a lot of silencing and a lot of guilt currently, and that's, yeah.
Angela, and one of our,
yeah, even in the most, like, some friends that are friends or people or peers, like people, the more I start to learn of it, it's challenging to know that I'm doing the same thing. So that's one thing in these conversations. I feel like I'm here to speak, but also more like it takes courage to even speak right now, because I'm coming to the party late in the game. I haven't been as aware of this in my life, as I haven't been told every step I take.
What I got from one of our conversations is that, isn't there people that you come across that are like clueless, or like when you
Yes.
bring up the suffering of others, they're like, well, it's the cruel
Yeah.
world, get over it.
Yeah, I would say, if I'm super honest, maybe like the people around me in general, not just my closest peers, even my peers, maybe 10% are learning, which is more than last year. So, they, maybe more than that, maybe more that I don't see, but there's still quite a large amount of even the most, like what I was saying, how I used to think I was, oh, I'm not racist, I don't care where you come from. It's not my place to say that. I was speaking with Amber about just acknowledging, I've known Amber for quite a few years, and just I've known as a gender or as a hardworking woman to be like what that takes in the world, but it didn't even clue to me 10 years ago on projects we worked with the rootedness of like the intersectional layers of what it is to be a woman of color, in a woman of indigenous heritage in Vancouver itself. And this was me like 10 years ago. And I'm saying I'm trying to open my eyes, and it's hard to see that, like, yeah. So I would say it's not, there's still quite a lot of just buying into what you're told. But more now than before of those that are not. So people that had thought they were on the outside are recognizing the outside is much further than where they thought they were. They were still within the really cushy confines of privilege. So.
Jerald, tell us about your experience, because right now there's a movement for people to be respected, to be treated equitably. You would think that by now in this country that talks a lot about, they're worried about what everybody else is doing in other countries and fighting for women's rights or minority rights in other places, but you would think that now there would be this acceptance of being aware that African Americans or American blacks are being mistreated, and that there's this dissonance. Like, what's the problem? I don't know what you guys are talking about. Um, Bad apples or whatever. Like, there's this dismissal of the suffering of the African American community, and now I think it's been years of pundits pushing for that, and now has been normalized. Tell us about your thoughts about your experience living in this environment, and then has it gotten better or worse as the years have gone by?
Well, we've actually covered a lot of ground so far with the conversations. I'd like to just comment on just one thing before talking about the other. I think that it's really, I think it's a good thing that so many people feel comfortable and empowered to self-identify in ways that they want. When I grew up as a kid, it was if you had one drop of black blood or just brown skin, black skin, you were black. And nowadays, we didn't have the language that people have today in the way, as far as in the way that we would identify ourselves. And I just think that when you were talking about the diversity within the Latino community, that people are somewhat shocked or surprised to learn that that everyone's not the same, and they shouldn't be shocked at this point. I think that it's an interesting time because it feels like people are learning more and more that they don't have the luxury of not knowing about other people, other cultures, and their experience. And I think that that's a really good thing. I don't know how far people are willing to go with the openness. I'm thinking about people like when it comes to, I'm trying to think of the lady's name. I want to say Rachel Dolezal. I don't know if you all, does that name sound familiar to you? She was a woman she was white, but she said she self-identified as black, and so she lived her life as a black woman. Do you all remember that?
Yeah.
So I feel like
Yeah.
there are some boundaries. I don't know where they necessarily are. I think that folks like Rachel, we can learn a lot from her perspective. There's a new movement, the ADOS movement. Have you all heard about that? American Descendants of Slaves. So these are Black Americans who want to make it clear that we're not people of color. We're not immigrant. We're non-immigrant Americans. We have our own history and experience and culture here, and it's important for people to know that so that they can actually see us and understand what our experiences are here in this country. And that perspective really makes a lot of people uncomfortable. So there seems to be this kind of awakening, this new openness to discussing, I guess, to looking at people through all kinds of different lenses, and I think that that's a good thing. But I want to make sure that I understand your question. Were you asking me more specifically about how do I feel about police brutality and what's happening nowadays, or you asked me what my experience was? But I want to make sure I'm clear.
Well, there's the issue of being in danger by the authorities, and there's the issue of the way that African Americans are perceived by the rest of the population. So I wanted to hear from your experience where you grew up and how it has, in the last decades that you've been alive. Have you seen a shift, or have you seen progress and then steps back? What has been like for you and the people around you with this sense of being fully embraced? Because you said there's people who are acknowledging that they're, we're all Americans, but we're still seen as the other. So is that part of the Black experience? Always being treated like
I mean,
like,
I would say Black folks are in many ways are like, they're folks that are under that umbrella too, the folks that are under the Latino umbrella as well. I mean, there's a lot of diversity within the Black community. But I grew up here in the Midwest. I'm in a small town. This was a stronghold of the Klan for years. I remember as a kid watching parades and things like that here in Anderson. And I think like most, like a lot of Black Americans from my generation, we were the group that were told, just get your foot in the door. Just don't complain about try and get at the table, and don't make a big, do what you got to do to get in, and then try and make a change once you get there. And so I think, and that was a big part of my career, my pursuits academically, with my career, that we were really just supposed to be satisfied to have more, I guess, proximity with the American, the so-called American dream. That was more important than any kind of personal suffering or sacrifice or limits that were placed on you. But I think a lot has changed. I mean, because I'm older, I'm experiencing things as a senior, an older person, and so race has its place. I never expected to be fully embraced by this country. My experience has always been I've had to leave America to actually feel like an American. And even that wasn't a robust feeling of being an American. But I think that my generation has wanted to believe that things have changed, but in many ways it hasn't. I think that, and it's painful to watch, but I'm hopeful because there are a lot of people in the younger generation in particular who are open to learning more about other people. They have access to information about other people, and they're making a difference. So I think it's easier for me at this point in my life to navigate through a lot of the racism that I encounter, because it's in order to survive, you have to learn how to do that, and recognize it and figure out what you need to do to protect yourself. But I don't think a lot has changed. But I still feel hopeful that there's a pathway for things to get a lot better. And I'm not always sure where that's coming from, but I feel like I have to be hopeful, or else it doesn't. Or else I would be that person doing more harm than good. And yeah, so I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's where my mind is today.
Well, in one of our previous conversations, you mentioned that to be, there's a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And they say, there's a difference between being pro diversity and being actively involved in bridge building and creating diverse communities. But then you run into the problem. It's like, I don't have an Asian friend, so I'm going to go find one. And then it becomes like forced that you're going to have a rainbow coalition of people around you. So, but in your experience, do you feel that the allies of the Black community are there out of the kindness of their heart, or like we discussed, is sometimes people have other motives, like if you help me, I'll help you, and that's why politics can muddy everything, because now you have activists from one group that go to Black Lives Matter or something else, and they expect to be supported in what they're doing. And then I remember you telling me, like, why can't these people just like be kind and loving and care for us without expecting anything in return?
I remember that conversation, and I still feel that people will come together when they come together, and whether it's around an issue that they both care about, or that's something that's clearly linked to their survival, they'll support each other. But I don't have the expectation that things won't change, that allies won't come and go, and I feel like that's okay. I feel like we contribute where we are and feel good about it, and then move on to the next chapter. And that works for me. That may not be the case for everyone else. But I don't, with regard to allies to the Black community, I mean, I try to navigate a space that's a little bit more intimate, and so I feel like I'm not, when I'm talking to you, I'm not talking to the Latino community. I'm not here necessarily right now to represent the Black community, whatever that means. I mean, I'm here representing myself and my desire to be the best person that I can be, and my desire to support other people who are nurturing and caring and supportive and kind in this moment. And I don't expect anything. I guess I don't expect anything as a result. Now, I feel like if someone comes to me and they say, I need your help with X, Y, and Z, and I give them that help and support, and they're abusive or disrespectful, or I'm taken for, I don't feel bad about letting folks know where my boundaries are. But by and large, I just feel like at this point in our history, I mean, I just feel like all we can really do is try to support each other and build each other up, because anything less than that, it just doesn't make any sense to me. And I know for a lot of people, that's that kind of thinking, it isn't necessarily very highbrow. It's very basic, and I think that we need to get back to that. Just respecting the natural world will lead to respecting one another. And in the end, I mean, it's saving ourselves and creating a future for ourselves and our children. So, this is a big subject. Ladies, if you want to jump in, I don't want to ramble. But again, I feel like at this point, and I think it's an age thing, I would rather spend my time and energy investing in people and being around people who do that and building people up than a lot of these what ifs, what if this, what if that, and or these long-term expectations from anyone else. We're here, our group, I don't know why we were brought together tonight, but I'd like to believe that something positive is good is going to come out of it, and because I believe that, I really feel that will be the case. So I will shut it down now and just let let someone else chime in.
Um, I'm going to speak just because, Amber, when you and I spoke, something that's standing out to me that I'm hearing a bit in what Jerald is saying is we were talking a little bit about the warriors and the nonviolent communicators and how it's not about, oh, you're doing this the wrong way or you're trying to get, equality the wrong way. Like punching across at each other isn't going to help. We have to work. If one person, like supports your cause and they're gaining something from it, they're supporting a cause. Cool. Like it would be great if they do it without any need for their own, but like I see some similarities in what we were talking about. So if you want to expand more on that, or what your kind of takeaway was from that, because I'm a firm believer in the nonviolent, like supporting and working together. There's a system that's oppressing everyone, even the tallest white man in the group. Like it's not a system that's healthy for humans to feel safe and survive and grow together as creatures. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think that, a lot of, I mean, we get wrapped up in terms as well, right? So like, and as well as how people are giving their message. So the frontline workers of the BLM or the First Nations, like any time that we do our protests and we stop, we need those angry warriors. That's what we were talking about. But those angry warriors, they have a place in the world of basically shining a light on the issues, but they have a hard time when they're brought to the table, because when you're at the table, you need to have a lot more understanding, and you need to allow for the allies to make mistakes. Like I posted something on my Instagram just yesterday about that, saying it's better to be an ally making mistakes than it is to just be passive. And that's the truth. However, the angry warriors, they can't actually have that like two-way dialogue, four-way dialogue, five-way dialogue, but they're necessary. So to say like one is doing one thing right or wrong, it kind of like defeats the entire purpose, because we need all of the soldiers, anytime that you're going into kind of, I hate using these kind of terms except that they work, I guess, but a battle of some sort, everybody has a different purpose and reason for being there. So I think like for me personally, I want to be at the table. So in doing that, I need to be also very understanding that when whoever I'm talking to is coming from a place of the system defined them. So, whether you're Caucasian and you're told that you have these entitlements, like that's something that you were told and you grew up in. So I have to honor that, and that you're going to make a mistake on the way, and you're going to have ideas that are not your own, and that you might offend me, but I have to hold my offense. And, when I talk to some First Nations people about advocacy, they're like, yeah, but it's not up to me. It's not up to me to not be offensive. And it's like, sure, except that if we're really trying to move forward, like it's like being in a marriage and thinking you can always yell at your husband. Like at some point in time, even though you're mad at him, you have to keep it down so you can make progress. So I think that we all have that place. I find it very interesting that like when we talk about racism, there's such a huge definition that we make. Like I find it interesting that David said earlier that like I kind of chuckled, because it doesn't even make logical sense to say that all Latinos should like each other, like that ever happens in any place, like suddenly we're all defined and the same. So, you must like each other. Or, this happens in the First Nations all the time with our culture, where I love this, I'm a hairdresser. So like, I have a lot of conversations in my chair, and we have a lot of First Nation studies here. And I will have usually a Caucasian, middle-aged, upper-aged female who will have taken one course and then start to tell me about my culture to my face. Like, and I'm like, oh, actually, you learned about Coast Salish culture on Wet'suwet'en. Oh, yeah. But, so when you guys do your weaving, actually, we don't do that. Well, yes, you do. you know, and I'm like, whoa, like, you know, but this is the very first like baby layer. They haven't even like, they can't even go that deep because they've just like lifted the sticker, you know. So we have to be okay with these if we're going to make progress. That's what we had talked about, right?
And I'm going to jump one more thing in to add. When you talked about the marriage, a lot of my understanding when I come to these conversations comes from the learning I've done with sexual trauma and with gender violence. And I remember once being at a circle of women of all ages, all colors, talking about not all colors, like many colors, talking about where they were at in their journey with it. Some were angry, some were avoidant, some were super passively understanding of it, some were just what I felt in that group was I understood that everyone is doing the best they can in a situation to survive and to try and open to loving one another, to try and feel safe and cared for. And we're within this structure that isn't necessarily built to provide that. And maybe it tried at one point, but it's failing horribly. So I also agree. It's like if whatever's being done, it's all some people might be leading the battle of like educate, we're going to change it through that. Some people might be leading it through being the fire blowers of like this is happening, and then others are sitting at the table. But there is a lot of progress happening. I feel like I'm watching society changing in my own lifetime, so I'm experientially witnessing it, and it's exciting to think about all the different people that are needed to create that kind of change. So even the woman in the chair and having the ability that you have to hold space for whatever she's going through in her journey to be trying, you know, doesn't like there's so many like to have that space that you shared of when you hear the stories, like what you were saying about sitting at the table, and I might have like I hope in our dialogue if I say something that offends, please let me know, but because I want to learn, but it's not your job to teach me, you know. So that thing of learning to hold that space of what it's going to feel like when we all start to change. It's not going to be svelte or graceful a lot of the times, you know.
No,
I mean,
it's definitely not comfortable.
I don't know, you know. Yeah.
Like when I talk to Caucasian people about this, and then they get the, you know, and again, because I've been told many times, I think this is my bridge, you know, is I keep that space for them. I let them stumble and they feel comfortable there, which is great. But it's an interesting thing because then they tell me all the things, and they're all the things that we all hear. You know, everybody, doesn't matter if you're Latin or Black or First Nations, we all hear the same things like, well, you know, they're doing it wrong. Like they shouldn't get so upset. And if they didn't say it in that way, I would accept it a lot easier. And I always just like let them finish what they're saying because, you know, oftentimes this is something that creates a lot more issues is if you interrupt. So I just like let them finish. And then I just like to just kind of poke at them a little bit and say something like, so how about if you also reflect on your reaction to that? You know, like, why are you reacting the way that you're reacting? Because you're upset that they pointed the finger at truth. You want this conversation of anti-racism to be comfortable. That's not a thing. This is not going to be comfortable. Facing yourself is not comfortable. Facing realities that Black men get shot by police officers almost every second day in the United States of America, that's not comfortable. You know, knowing that a female on the east coast of Canada was killed by a police officer, shot her 10 times while also beat her and broke her leg, like, and said that was a wellness check, that's not okay. That's not comfortable. Saying that I have 10 times more likelihood to get killed by somebody versus a white person in Canada, that's not comfortable. So to expect that this is going to be easy and that, you know, seeing yourself when we shine a mirror at you is going to be easy, it's not. But it's going to be empowering. It's going to be heartwarming. It's going to be heart opening. And it's going to change the world if we all can get there, you know? But it takes uncomfortable conversation. It takes patient conversation. It takes empathy and understanding. I think that's the only way that we can really get there.